Mr. President, as we approach a final vote on the National Defense Authorization Act, I want to take this opportunity to thank my friend and colleague from Rhode Island, Senator Reid. Despite his lack of substantive education somewhere on the Hudson River, he has been thoughtful, bipartisan, and he's maintained that throughout the consideration of this legislation. We worked together through hundreds of amendments and markup and hundreds more during the past 2 weeks. And obviously we have some differences from time to time. Senator Reid has never stopped searching for common ground and consensus. And so this legislation would not be what it is without his leadership and his cooperation. I would just remind my friend, however, that the title of this legislation is to authorize appropriations. To authorize appropriations. Not to appropriate, but to authorize appropriations. That is the task of the Appropriations Committee. And so the OCO issue, which he and I are largely in agreement with, should have been repeal of sequestration. That is an issue that should be addressed where the authority lies in appropriations, not in authorization. We can't increase or decrease a single penny of authorization except what was given to us through the Budget Committee process, which was votes and decisions made on this floor on the budget. So I say with respect and friendship, if there is a problem here, it's not with the authorization. It's not with the authorization. We don't spend a penny. We authorize the expenditure of money, and that is an issue that my friend from Rhode Island and I disagree with, but it did not prohibit him and me and our staffs and members of the committee on both sides of the aisle from working on a piece of legislation that, in my view, which is clearly subjective, is a reform bill working together that is almost unprecedented, at least in the last 30 years, when you look at the extent and the nature of the reforms in this legislation. I want to thank the Majority Leader, Senator McConnell, for his commitment to resuming regular order. Under Senator McConnell's leadership, the Senate has been able to take up this critical national security legislation on time, allowing for thoughtful consideration amendment. And this is how the Senate should operate. Regular order, on time, giving our military the certainty they need to plan and execute their missions. For 53 consecutive years, Congress has passed the National Defense Authorization Act. That's a testimony to the vital importance of this legislation, which provides the necessary funding and authorities for our military to defend the nation. But perhaps at no time in the last half century has this legislation ever been so critical. Over the past few months, the Senate Armed Services Committee has received testimony from many of America's most respected statesmen, thinkers, and former military commanders. These leaders had a common warning, and that warning is clear. America is facing the most diverse and complex array of crises since the Second World War. And I won't go into all the different events that have taken place that authenticate that assertion by the most respected leaders, both that served under both Republican and Democrat administrations. We've faced challenges before. We marshaled our power, both soft and hard power, to defend the rules-based international order that is the foundation of our prosperity and security. We've deterred aggression, defended allies, defeated adversaries, and built peace through strength. As we look at our challenges today, the question being asked all over the world by both friend and foe alike, and the question we must now answer, are we equal to those challenges again? There's only so much one piece of legislation can do to answer that question. But the National Defense Authorization Act before the Senate today is a strong first step toward rising to the challenge of an increasingly dangerous world. This is an ambitious piece of legislation, but in the times we live, we cannot afford business as usual, in the Department of Defense. To prepare our military to confront our present and future national security challenges, we must champion the cause of defense reform, rigorously root out Pentagon waste, and invest in modernization and next-generation technologies to maintain our military technological advantage. That's what this legislation is all about. It's a reform bill. It tackles acquisition reform, headquarters and management reform, military retirement reform, personnel reform. The bill authorizes every dollar of the President's budget request of $612 billion, but focuses these resources more directly on our warfighters. The Armed Services Committee identified $10 billion of excess and unnecessary spending in the budget request, and we reinvested those savings in the military capabilities our troops need to succeed. And we did all of this while upholding our commitments to our service members, retirees, and their families. My friends, America's military technological advantage is eroding and eroding fast. And one of the primary causes of this is a broken defense acquisition system that takes too long, costs too much, and wastes billions of dollars, often on weapons programs that never become operational, and with no one ever being held responsible. That's why this legislation includes the most sweeping acquisition reforms in a generation. We put the services back into the acquisition process, create new mechanisms to ensure accountability for results, streamline regulation, and open the defense acquisition process to our nation's innovators. This bill advances unprecedented reforms to our military retirement system. Under the current 70-year-old system, 83% of service members leave the service without any retirement assets. This system excludes the vast majority of current service members who will not complete 20 years of uniformed service, including many veterans of the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. The NDAA creates a modernized retirement system and extends retirement benefits to the vast majority of service members through a new plan offering more value and choice. Under this new plan, 75% of service members would get retirement benefits. This reform is estimated to save $15 billion a year in the out years. In addition to retirement reform, the NDAA focuses on improving the quality of life of our military service members, retirees, and their families. It authorizes a 1.3% pay raise for members of the uniformed services in the grade of 06 and below, $30 million in support for schools that serve military-dependent children, including those with severe disabilities. It includes many provisions to improve the military health system and TRICARE. The NDAA allows a TRICARE beneficiary up to 4 urgent care visits without making them get a pre-authorization, and requires the Department of Defense to focus more on health care quality, patient safety, and beneficiary satisfaction by making them publish health outcome measures on their websites. It builds on military justice reforms of the past few years to prevent and respond to military sexual assault. It contains a number of provisions aimed at strengthening the authorities of Special Victims Counsel to provide services to victims of sexual assault. It enhances confidential reporting options for victims of sexual assault and increases access to timely disclosure of certain materials and information in connection with the prosecution of offenses. On management reform, it ensures that the Department of Defense and the military services are using precious defense dollars to fulfill their missions, defend the nation, not expand their bloated staffs. While staff at Army headquarters increased 60% over the past decade, the Army is now cutting brigade combat teams. The Air Force evaded mandated cuts to headquarters personnel by creating 2 new headquarters entities, while at the same time complaining it had insufficient personnel to maintain combat aircraft. The NDAA directs targeted reductions in headquarters and administrative staff that will generate $1.7 billion in savings in just the next fiscal year. With these savings and billions more identified, this bill invests in providing critical military capabilities for our war fighters and meeting unfunded priorities of our service chiefs and combatant commanders. Even as challenges to maritime security increase in the Middle East and the Western Pacific and pressures on our shipbuilding budget increase, the Navy remains well below its fleet size requirement of 306 ships. The NDAA directs savings identified in the budget request to accelerate Navy modernization, shipbuilding, mitigate impacts of the Ohio-class ballistic missile submarine replacement, and to grow the Navy to meet rising steps. As adversaries seek to counter and thwart American military power, the NDAA looks to the future, invests in the technologies that will maintain America's military technological superiority, provides $400 million in additional funding to support the so-called third offset strategy to outpace our emerging adversaries. It entails robust assistance to our allies and partners as they confront urgent challenges, nearly $3.8 billion in support of the Afghan security forces. After an overwhelming bipartisan vote on an amendment offered by Senator Feinstein and myself, the NDAA reaffirms the prohibition on torture and ensures that every U.S. government agency always applies the same effective, humane interrogation standards as the U.S. military. Past interrogation policies compromised our values, stained our national honor, and did little practical good. This legislation provides greater assurances that never again will the United States follow that dark path of sacrificing our values for our short-term security needs. I thank Senator Feinstein for her hard work on this vitally important issue. Finally, legislation contains a bipartisan compromise on how to address the challenge of the detention facility of Guantanamo Bay. President Obama has said from day one of his presidency that he wants to close Guantanamo, but 6.5 years into his administration, the administration has never provided a plan to do so. This legislation requires the administration to submit that plan. We're simply asking the executive branch to explain where it will hold those set for trial, how it will continue to detain dangerous terrorists pursuant to the laws of war, and how it will mitigate the risks of moving this population. If the administration can provide answers to these basic questions to the satisfaction of the American people and their elected representatives, then congressional restrictions on the movement of these detainees will be lifted and the plan can be implemented. If the Congress does not approve the plan, nothing would change. The ban on domestic transfers would stay in force, and the certification standards for foreign transfers included in the NDAA would remain. My friends, America has reached a key inflection point. The rules-based international order, which has been anchored by U.S. hard power for 7 decades, is being seriously stressed, and with it, the foundation of our security and prosperity. It does not have to be this way. We can choose a better future for ourselves, make the right decisions now, and set our nation on a better course. That is what this legislation is all about, living up to our constitutional duty to provide for the common defense, increasing the effectiveness of our military, and restoring America's global leadership. This legislation is a small step towards accomplishing these goals, but it is an important step we can take right now together. We owe the brave men in uniform nothing less